I was born 49. Alcan poured their first aluminum ingot in 1954. oolichan came in 1970 and started pumping effluent into our river. And I said earlier, Haisla is the water that we're sitting in right now. The foot of the Kitimat River and about 10 or 12 miles out into the channel here is Haisla. And in days prior to Alcan, it was described as a dinner plate of the Haisla people. Pretty much everything that this community required, our community required, could be found in this area without too much travel. The site that Alcan sits on currently, where their modernization plan is taking place, is called Yaxta. 2 Anderson Creek and Moore Creek drain into the channel here, and those 2 creeks combined produced coho in such numbers that our people didn't have to go anywhere else for coho. It was just those 2 little systems. And a few years back, Alcan was bragging to the media that they had 6 returning spawning coho that particular year. And the reason I raise that is because, I think this is a worldwide issue. We fished down the food chain, or we've used the food chain to a point where it's, personally, I think it's in jeopardy from a number of perspectives. In Haisla here in the Kitimat River, we have a reserve, an Indian reserve as they call it, some gas. It's where our people boil oolicans to make oolichan oil, which up until 1970, by the way, when oolichan came, was still the most important foodstuff for the Haisla people, the oil that was rendered at that site. And we estimated that the Haisla people harvested up to 600 to 650 ton of oolichan annually on that site. As a young person, 9 or 10 years old, growing up, I recall vividly standing in a foot or 2 of water on the banks of the Kitimat River, picking up oolicans by the handful into tubs for smoking. That was our job as children. Was taking the second run, which was, there was so much oolicans, they were trapped against the bank and they couldn't escape, so we picked them up by hand. And now that oolichan in the 5 rivers in our system, in our territory, there's 5 rivers that sustained an oolichan run. Every one of them, as far as I'm concerned, is extinct. Every one of them. And the steelhead were thick, feeding on the oolicans on the banks of the river. When I was a kid, people would stand there and watch the steelhead slashing and feeding in the school of oolichan. Now they're gone, and people wonder why we have to argue over the few steelhead that are left. As you may know, it happens everywhere. When food becomes scarce or a commodity becomes scarce, people start fighting over it. That's a typical human response, is to argue and fight and blame one another with respect to who is responsible. And I've taken this position for a few years now that we've all contributed to one way or another. The canneries that existed on the coast of British Columbia here, in the case of Butedale, which is on Princess Royal Island, you passed coming up here, I had one of my father's friends tell me that as a youth he was paid 13 cents an hour to push salmon off of a scow into the channel beside Butedale. Each crew had barge that carried 60,000 pieces of salmon, and there was 2 per crew. So 120,000 pieces of fish were dumped into the middle of the channel. And there was 3 crews going 24 hours a day. There was so much salmon they couldn't process it all, so they just dump it. So I start there because we've all participated in one way or another of damaging the environment, or however you want to look at it, and the resources that are contained in this environment of ours, to a point where I agree with the school of thought that we're at a tipping point. As Suzuki says, we might only have a few years left, and if we don't correct it, it might be too late. And I also believe that, just like our body, the human body, it's not rocket science. I mean, we know that if you put good stuff into your body, stuff that is not going to cause diabetes, obesity, and heart problems and all that stuff, the Earth's the same way. If we start treating it with respect, and we don't allow pollution to go in, we don't clear cut too much, we don't harvest too much salmon, we don't dig too many holes in the ground in bad places, I think that the Earth will take care of itself and will heal itself to a point where we don't have to worry too much about it. But are we going to learn? My experience and my observation, I think it's not that I'm a smart person or anything, but just watching people. And you look at the Prime Minister of our country right now, he's literally dragging us back to an era where the environment didn't mean a damn thing to people. Our government is actually walking backwards in a bad way. If the Prime Minister is walking backwards to a point where they started to exert their influence in a positive way, to maybe to cut back on harvesting, to cut back on mining activities, and do the good projects instead of attempting to do every one that's applied for. We've got to learn to do more with less, I think, in our lifetime, and I don't see that happening right now with leaders like we have here in Canada.
You referenced some other projects. I know the Kitimat liquid natural gas terminal has been treated somewhat differently and received some local support. Could you speak to maybe some differences between that project and Enbridge?
Well, I think our community has embraced the liquefied natural gas, or the natural gas, the movement of natural gas through this area. The problem, as I see it, in that, with respect to that decision, is that we haven't had a conversation yet about how many might be enough or too much. Currently, there's 7 projects on the books, some of them massive export proposals by companies that have Shell and Korean Gas and Sinopec as partners in it. And as far as I'm concerned, even if they have 4 or 5 of these in this little area of ours, it might be too much from a number of perspectives. One, I think the sheer amount of land that would be developed, as they put it, here in this little area here. As you see, it's not a very, very big area. It's kind of closed in, and nobody's really done a good study on what might be enough development here, and there are people who would like it, every one of them, to happen, right? As far as I'm concerned, one might be enough, because they're not going to create employment for our people, because most of the people will be employed with the development that's already here. The other thing is just the amount of ship traffic that's moving up and down the channel. I mean, I'm not sure how many exactly, but if every one of them went ahead, that's a hell of a lot more ship traffic than we currently have, and nobody really understands what the impact of the existing traffic's been over the years. So that's one of the areas, and I think as well, I've said, my grandmother said to me one time, the biggest right that we have as Native people is the right to be responsible. And ever since he said that to me, and I think it's true. And we also have to understand, I think, that we have responsibilities to one another as people. We have the community of Hartley Bay down the coast. We have people living on Haida Gwaii. Decisions that we make here today have the potential to impact every one of them. In the old days, we didn't have the kind of development, of course, that's coming at us. So decisions we made here most likely wouldn't have impacted people from Hartley Bay or from Clemptu or any of those other little communities. But now, with issues like ship traffic and ocean dumping of bunker oil and whatnot, I mean, or just ballast water. I mean, all these issues. We know what the impact has been in other places, and yet we just appear to be walking blindly into that same problem, potentially. Well, with respect to the Enbridge project, my understanding is that there's, after they've actually built the place, and if it does get to production where they're moving oil through our area here, it would amount to about 35 jobs locally. A little over 200 for the entire pipeline. And a friend of mine pointed out a couple of years ago that if it is indeed 35 jobs, why the heck don't we just build another Rona? I mean, Rona and Terrace employs about 35 people. Yeah, and that's with respect to the risks that are involved with it. It just doesn't seem logical if you're looking at it from a local perspective, But the Prime Minister is arguing that it's in a national interest to build this pipeline down to Kitimat, and I think people that have looked at the economics of it and that have looked at the job creation and looked at the versus the risks disagree. It's probably not in the national interest to build this project, but they seem intent on doing so.
What would an oil spill do to this community, to the village in Kitimat? What would it look like?
Well, I was down in the Gulf not too long ago, and the Homa people and the Cajun shrimp fishermen out in the Gulf said to us, we've survived all kinds of disasters, natural and otherwise, and we will not survive an oil spill. We won't. Our culture won't survive this spill. And they pointed out to us that on the Mexican side of the Gulf, there are communities there who are completely reliant now on the oil industry. They used to be fishermen, like our communities were. Like this community of ours was, we lived on fish, and when the commercial fishing industry was born, people naturally gravitated to it because they knew how to fish salmon. We've already had our problems with that industry, but when you look at it from a commercial industry and also a sustenance from a sustenance point of view, I agree with the people from the Gulf who said that to us. We won't survive it. Our culture won't survive. As people, as individuals, we'll probably get through it, but our language is down to 10% at the moment of fluent speakers, maybe less. The people that process salmon in our community are declining in numbers in terms of people who know how to harvest, know how to prepare, and all of that stuff. And but there seems to be a resurgence in this, and some of it is economic, because people know that we get all this fresh seafood around us, and if you can harvest it locally here instead of buying it from Overweighty or one of the other grocery stores, it means there's more money in your pocket at the end of the year to do other things. So there is an economic component to even our own sustenance fishing, that isn't appreciated by the powers that be. So I think from a numbers perspectives, our community will have a completely different face, and some have even suggested that we won't be Haisla anymore, because being Haisla means being connected to salmon, halibut, oolicans that were on the Kitimat River, and all the other resources. That's what identified us as a people. Well, it varies with respect to each individual family, but there, however, there's I think, like I said, there's a growing awareness that there's an economic component. So it'll change. At the moment, it kind of was taking a dip in terms of the amount of people that were actually relying on the sustenance fisheries, they call it. But right now, in terms of my own family, we were speaking about this the other day, my sister and I, and we figured that at this point in time, probably 60 to 70% of our food is caught naturally now. And that includes salmon, clams and cockles, halibut, black cod, all other kinds of cod, and then, of course, moose and deer and seal. So it's a fairly large number still, even at this point. And with an oil spill, that'll change dramatically. There's no doubt in my mind that every one of our clam beaches will be impacted. Our herring's another one. The herring industry. We know that up in Alaska, 20 plus years after the fact, there's still not a viable herring run to be commercialized or to be caught for sustenance. So, that's another area. And the herring are just coming back here. The numbers, we think are rebounding from being overfished during the commercial heyday of that fishery.
A lot of people, their initial reaction when they hear about this issue is, what's the big deal? There's all this technology, double hold tankers and pipelines run all over the continent, et cetera, et cetera. But looking around, this is not coastal Louisiana. It's rugged terrain, and Douglas Channel is.
Well, one of the there's two things that technology can't take care of, that new technology or any kind of technology can't take care of. You can't make me comfortable by saying that there's so much improvement in equipment. Human error and equipment failure. It's going to happen as long as there's people alive and there's equipment moving around. A case in point, St. Petersburg, a ship that came out of Alcan here I think it had ore on it. It ran into Maitland Island a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now, I guess, maybe more. And it experienced what they described as extreme gyroscopic failure, which simply meant that they lost control of the ship. Their steering failed, and they ran into the island, pushed the bow completely and ripped it open, but it didn't dump any of its cargo out. And people make mistakes. To me, it's as simple as that. What more can you say? That's what happens. That's why accidents happen. People screw up and equipment fail.
In this case, it seems like a spill might be especially bad given the nature of the product. It's not. It's been called oil, you know, an oil pipeline, but it's not actually the case. It seems that it'll actually sink when it hits the water.
And I, you know, you've been on the coast. I mean, people that have been on the coast know what the risks are. I mean, out on the coast of Pitt Island, just up outside of Hartley Bay, Granville Channel runs between Pitt Island and the mainland, and on the west coast of Pitt Island, if anyone's had the opportunity to fly over it like we have on occasion, and even to motor a boat in that area, you can imagine an oil spill getting into the little inlets there. It's pitted with small inlets that the tide rushes in and out of it, and there's absolutely no way on God's green earth they're going to be able to clean up any oil spill that happens in that area. It just can't happen. The wind conditions are enormous. I mean, they're the largest sustained wave in human history, recorded history, happened right outside here, just outside of us, out on the coast. I can't remember. It was like approaching 100 feet away for a 6-hour period. And I mean, down in the Gulf, for instance, when we were there, they had almost $1 billion worth of equipment sit at anchor, and we asked the people there why aren't they working. There was a 1-foot chop out in the Gulf, and they couldn't work because the booms that they were trying to contain in effect, it had to be flat calm for their booms to work. With a 1-foot chop, the oil boom, you know what I'm talking about, the booms that they collect the oil in and trap the oil in, they wouldn't work because they just splash out of the boom. And up here, it's rare to have that calm for a sustained period. It doesn't happen. Yeah. No, that's what the Coastal First Nations organization, which includes nine communities on the coast here, made a declaration under their own authority that they banned very large crude carriers from these waters, from the waters of the north and central coast, and that's a ban that still exists, and there are none, absolutely no one of our communities are in support of that particular project, the Enbridge project.
And what sort of offer was made that has been refused? Is it partnership or?
Well, they call it an offer, but I don't think it was an offer. You know, there was no discussion. There was just an arbitrary number by the company who said that they'd offer 10% of the, and this would be amongst all of the affected First Nations along the pipeline route and the tanker route. So they offered a 10% equity to buy it for us to buy into the project, and in effect to help them build the damn thing. You know, and I don't think that was ever taken seriously by anybody. In our communities, I don't think it really was. It's ridiculous. I mean, I think a lot of people have seen through it. I'm hoping they have. You know, they like even our communities have been accused of being radicals or accused of taking foreign money to fight against the Canadian economy, and it's pure BS. I'll put it that way. Coastal First Nations has spent about $300 million in the last 10 years as an organization, attempting to put together marine use plans, land use plans for every one of our communities that are sustainable plans. And the attempt is, and this work is still ongoing, the attempt is to build an economy in the area that's actually sustainable. And a case in point is there's an agreement with the Chinese company recently that started a scallop hatchery up in Prince Rupert. And those scallops are going to be grown out in the waters of our communities up and down the coast here. And if everything pans out the way the plan has been formulated, it'll mean about 500 jobs for our communities, amongst our communities. And by no means is it going to take care of all of the unemployment, but it's one that if it gets up and running and actually succeeds, it's a sustainable enterprise. I mean, I don't think people will quit eating scallops anytime soon. It's a delicacy for a lot of people. And that $300 million has come from groups like the Moore Foundation down in the United States, who are being targeted by the governments and by other people who want this oil development to go through. And that's a lot of money for a small community like ours to spend attempting to do right by our own communities. Because we look at what happened to us here in Kitimat. oolichan was here for 30 years. They polluted our oolicans to a point where we couldn't use them, and then they left. That's not sustainable development. That's like it's a sunset industry kind of thing. They know that as soon as they're not making money, they're out of here, and they leave people locally holding the bag. And I think that's what Coastal First Nation has been attempting to do, and that's why I think that that the government is absolutely wrong when they attempt to brand these organizations that we work with as radicals. I've worked with a lot of these people, and they're not radical people. I mean, it's some of them have actually been involved with this planning process of ours that has been going on. So I think it's completely irresponsible, is the gentlest I can put it, for our own government to be branding people who care about the earth as being radical. I think Suzuki said it best. David Suzuki. The people who stand on the road, he said, are the heroes. The grandmothers and the elders who stand on the road to stop bad logging practices, they're the heroes. He said the real radicals are the people who, in these big boardrooms, who want to dig giant holes in the ground, pollute waterways, fill up lakes with sludge as tailing ponds. He said those are the radicals, not the grandmothers and the people who care about their territory. Well, I think your last comment is really where is a good starting point. Our community, our leadership in our council, the elected council, for a period of about 5 to 6 years now, have been writing letters to the National Energy Board, to Canadian Environmental Assessment Authority, to the government, attempting to get some agreement with them on what the review process would look like with respect to the Enbridge pipeline. And it was standard form letters of response, if we got any, if the council got any response from government and from these agencies. There was absolutely no attempt made to accommodate our community's interest in the process. That's one of the issues up here in Canada. In the Constitution, Section 35, Aboriginal rights and title are affirmed, although we still have to prove it if we want to go to court. but through the court cases, a series of court cases that have happened, consultation and accommodation are a requirement. The government is getting away with defining by themselves what accommodation and consultation will look like, and that's what the attempt has been, from our community's point of view, is to seek out an accommodation in the process. Accommodation isn't just about money. It isn't just about resources. It's about actually having a say in how the decisions are going to be made with respect to projects that would be coming into our area like Enbridge. And like I say, there's been absolutely no cooperation from government. There's been no attempt to accommodate our interests from that point of view. So it was no surprise to me personally that the government went in that direction, and I think Ben, that people in Canada generally, and I think that other countries as well, because this is not just about Canada. This decision is not just about Canada. It's going to impact people other places. The decision to water down and to minimize the amount of time that we have to look at these projects. I mean, when you look at the Enbridge file, so to speak, the amount of information that our community has to look at, I don't know how many years it took Enbridge to put it together, but our communities don't have the same resources as these big companies do to look at the information that they've produced. And if the process is going to mean anything, it should mean giving the few experts that we've been able to get a hold of the opportunity to look at this material and to make proper comment in it. But that's not going to happen if the government actually shoves this stuff down our throat. So I think that this kind of action on the part of governments is what revolutions have been made of. I mean, when people don't trust their government anymore, or they see governments riding roughshod over their rights, I think that people generally start to stand up and take stronger action on their own. And like I was saying to you the other day, I think we're seeing that happen. It's not just the Indians and environmentalists anymore. There's people from towns of Smithers, the municipalities of Smithers, Rupert, Terrace, regional district of Skeena, Queen Charlotte. I mean, these are municipalities who are now coming out and opposing this Enbridge project. And it appears that Stephen Harper and Joe Oliver are going to ignore even them. The Gunton report, that's right. Well, Coastal First Nations decided that this was before I became re-involved with them, but they decided when they first heard about the Enbridge proposal, they decided to, instead of reacting simply, even though like I said, it's not rocket science. I mean, we've got evidence from around the globe that when you spill oil into an environment, it has severe consequences, serious consequence. And even though there's this gut reaction, or this in your gut, that it's the right position to take, they still attempted to do their due diligence and hired Tom Gunton to take a look at the existing information that Enbridge was producing at the time, and to research look at the terrain that they were going to be coming through, and it turns out that I think Tom Gunton, from what I've seen of his report, identified a few of the areas that are really, other than the ship traffic or the tanker traffic, there's never been an attempt to put a pipeline through the terrain that this proposed pipeline is going to come through if they get to go ahead and actually start building it. So in effect, we're a huge experiment. This whole area is a big experiment in pipeline building, and that's why coastal First Nations took the position they did, is they didn't want our communities to be used as an experiment.
And it's an experiment that's already failed in a few areas, like Kalamazoo River in Michigan, which
those are the reasons why I've always contended that we don't learn very quick. As the human species is a very slow learner. Every time, I mean, on every occasion where we make these kind of changes or do these kind of projects, there are consequences. Some of them we can recover from, and others, like this one, is just why a lot of people are so passionate about it. People, I think, understand that in our lifetimes, and in Carson's lifetime, who was with me today on your boat, if a spill happens today in her lifetime, more than likely it wouldn't, the impact wouldn't be over. So there's a growing number of people, both from this area, from the northwest here, and from the province, and from across Canada, who are now beginning to understand what is at stake here. I was in Winnipeg a few weeks back, and 350 people showed up at an evening to listen to a few speakers, including myself, talk about the Enbridge project. And we're in contact with some of those people and their organizations still. So there are people who now understand, I think, that this is isn't a national interest, but from a different perspective. That's something that I simply don't understand today. When you find out that the eastern part of Canada imports oil, and we're prepared to ship raw bitumen to China to have it processed and then sent back to us more than likely, it doesn't make a lot of sense. This is going on all over. I mean, when Walmart first moved into our area up in Terrace there, up in the Terrace area, and my wife went in. I went in with her the very first time I went in there. I walked around looking, and I came to a frozen food section that had a chunk of salmon, marked product of China. Some salmon. And if you know the area, Walmart, where I was standing, if the walls weren't there, I could probably throw a rock into the Skeena River from where this frozen food section was. So some salmon, product of China, sold on the banks of one of the best salmon producing rivers on the coast of North America, and people in Terrace are buying salmon from China. I mean, that it just doesn't make sense to me. And I think it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. We're currently stuffing wood into containers up in Terrace that are brought up to Prince Rupert and sent over to China. And I have a friend, Terry Glavin, who's been looking at the Chinese connection here, and it turns out that with respect to this Enbridge pipeline, Sinopec, which has an interest in the tar sands now, purchased a small, I think it was called Tanzania oil. Sinopec bought it, or China bought it, for $4.2 billion. And with that, they got a veto vote on where Syncrude could send their oil. So there's a huge influence now from offshore on our natural resources. The Prime Minister apparently has no concern over that, but he's concerned about a minuscule amount of money coming in from the United States to help people like us in our small communities and the groups that we work with do our own due diligence when it comes to projects like this. And that's, it's nonsensical that they give away resources, never mind sipping it out, but actually almost giving it away, getting a few bucks in return. But once that's over, where are we going to turn? Yeah. Some of this stuff might be better left in the ground. I think Cecil, my friend Cecil Pauls from our community here, put it best, and some people look at it as simplistic thinking. However, I think it made a lot of sense. It makes sense to a lot of people when he referred to the Kitlope, and it's kind of the way our people looked at this area here. These areas are bank. It's like a bank to people who sustain themselves from it. If you have a bank account and you keep taking and taking and taking and never put anything back or saving anything for a rainy day, eventually you go broke. You run out of money. You run out of resources, and that's, I think that's where governments and industry are taking us. There's going to come a point, some point where there's nothing left in the bank. What do we do then? Where do we turn? Our community here, Alcan is a business. At some point, they might do a oolichan and pull the plug and move on out. Where do our people turn then? If the resources are depleted to a point and damaged to a point where we can't harvest anymore, like the oolicans are gone. The abalone we haven't had a taste of abalone on the outer coast here for 25 years now. Overfished. Period of 15 years they were fished out to a point where they were going extinct, and they haven't recovered enough to even eat. Never mind making a few bucks off them. Well, I think it's like fresh water. My understanding of it is that we have call on like 3% of the fresh water on Earth. That's what sustains us. So it looks like it's a pretty fine. The margins are pretty fine when it comes to how we impact the sources of fresh water, and like you say, people in these areas have been pretty skeptical about any discussion about the scarceness of fresh water, but the big but in it is, one oil spill, again, going back to the project, one oil spill into the Kitimat River and the town of Kitimat is out of fresh water, as they get their water right from the Kitimat River, and where are they going to turn? I think that we, to some degree, have been negligent as communities when it comes to water policy. The province of BC is currently undergoing. They put it on the back burner for a while, for a number of reasons, but they're looking at doing a new water act, or revamping the Water Act somehow. And I think our communities need to step up to the plate and involve themselves in that discussion somehow, because you've seen where governments usually take us is it's looked at as strictly as a commodity, and that's without water. There's not much left to argue about. I mean, if salmon don't have adequate fresh water, if these the habitat issues that the conservative government seem to be taking us back to, people that know anything about salmon and the habitat they require, and they talk about drainage ditches, for instance. That's what Joe Oliver, I think, was speaking about, was too often the process gets hung up because there's a salmon in the drainage ditch. So the project is held up, and municipalities can't do their work in due course. It takes too long to go through these processes. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you look at Kitimat, and I think every municipality that's been built has been built over creeks. We've encapsulated creeks into concrete drainage ditches. They call them drainage ditches, but in fact, that water was always there. It's just now that they made it look like a ditch, and it always had, prior to Alcan in this case here in Kitimat, there is a drainage ditch that's called a drainage ditch that comes right down through the middle of the community, but prior to Alcan, that is part of the system that sustained coho. Coho reared in those channels. That's why they still go back there. But we call them drainage ditches. So now the conservative government, by streamlining the process, I think is going to take us back to an era where it's possible for companies to just completely disregard that important part of the system. The systems are a little bit more complicated than they want people to believe. Those river systems.